way that I like to evaluate, and that we certainly did back then, it was just the team playing it, whoever's making it. It's like the target audience is ourselves, we want to make something that we're into and that we're interested in. And instead of doing a PowerPoint presentation, quite often teams would do if they're going to go and pitch an idea, we put everything into this 2D demo, so you actually run around and anything that we wanted to say was in the background and you could pull it around. And it was a really kind of fresh, original way of showing off what we wanted to do. And they said, we've got this thing called Steam, we want to start releasing third-party projects on it and things. Will you be our guinea pig, essentially? And I'm like, yeah, sounds cool.
Can we start with this? You are like a polyglot in game development. You do everything, right? You do like programming, you do art, you do design, you do production. Like, how did it happen that like you kind of do everything?
Well, yeah, good question. I don't think that's actually quite so unusual for people of my kind of generation, because, when I first got into computers and computer games, this was like in the early 80s when the home computers were first sort of, hitting the market. I got my Commodore 64, and in terms of making games, it was much more common for like one person to make an entire game, maybe two, maybe you'd have like a programmer and an artist and a musician at the most. That would be the biggest, But yeah, I was always kind of into science and physics and things. So programming kind of really appealed to me. But I was also really into art. I used to draw a lot as a child. So I always loved art, and that was one of my strengths at school. And music as well. I've always loved music. I used to play a lot in like indie bands with my friends. Guitar, you can see some guitars.
Yeah.
In the background, I still enjoy doing that a lot. So I love all of those things, and that's kind of the main appeal for me to get into computer games at all, really. It was an excuse to use all of those different things in one place and together, so it really appeals to me. So yeah, I just love all of them. I mean, I'm certainly not a master of all of them. I'd say my art side is much stronger than my programming side, but but my main superpower, if you like, is just I'm determined. I would just be like, well, it's possible, and that person did it, so I know that I can do it, even if it takes me 100 times as long. I know it's possible. So I'm quite good at sort of self-disciplining myself, and if I want to make something happen, I'll keep going at it and get there eventually. I mean, some of my code, for example, would make proper coders probably laugh, because it's often quite simple, and I spend more time formatting the code and making it look pretty to read than I do anything else. But I would say, in my defence there, actually, an old colleague of mine who I think you've had on this podcast, Alex Evans, he's an amazing programmer. He's definitely the biggest brain I've ever met in this world. And he actually taught me a lot of little coding tricks and things, and he would look at my code and say, it's so simple, it's genius. It's very easy to debug. I'm not using like dynamic memory allocation or anything like that. I'm old school. I'll just be like, no, I know how much memory I want, I'm just going to reserve that at the beginning and then just manage that myself, that kind of stuff.
It's a lost art now. It's a lost art.
But yeah, I've just always loved all of those different disciplines, and I still do, so that's one.
Hi everyone, let me take a break to thank members of the show who made this conversation possible. Members get earlier access to videos, including longer unedited footage from live streams, as well as they're invited to our private Discord server. If you want to support the show, there is no better way than becoming a member on YouTube or Patreon. Thank you so much. At some point, did you focus more on art, or how did you become more trained, well-versed in art specifically?
Yeah, so literally my foot in the door, if you like, was back in the 80s. I had my Commodore 64 and I was making various little demos, and, I'm sure lots of people go through this. They start a game, never finish it because they get a more interesting idea to move on to. It's very common. So I was doing lots of things like that. And then one thing led to another, and I met this guy who was actually a genuine Spectrum programmer. There was the Sinclair Spectrum, that was almost like the arch rival of the Commodore 64 back then. in terms of, Xbox versus PlayStation type playground wars. But he was actually making, or had made, some games for the Spectrum and was making another one. And I got introduced to him, and he took me. I showed him some of my demos, and he took me to Codemasters, which was back then used to make like sort of pocket money, cheap games on cassette, and that was quite often the way a lot of programmers would first get into the industry, because the games could be quite, sort of small projects. I went there to meet him. Actually, I remember on the way there as well thinking, shit, he's probably going to expect me to pitch an idea to a game. I haven't thought of anything, so I need to think of something quickly in the way in the car. And I got there and I came up with this stupid thing, Celestial Garbage Collector, which was like Defender in space, but you're collecting garbage or something. And this was David Darling, who was the owner at the time. Very unimpressed, and probably thought I was a complete idiot. And but he was nice, and he basically said, why don't you just do the Commodore 64 version of your friend's game, which turned out to be KGB Super Spy. So that was my first game. I did that, programming in machine code, trial by fire. I mean, I didn't even know how to scroll the screen when I took that contract on, so I had to learn quite fast. But I did that, did my own graphics, and they commented a lot on the graphics, saying, who did your graphics? They're really good. And I'm like, I just did them myself. And basically after that, I got that released, I just kind of started getting people wanting me to do the graphics for them. And I was very happy to do that, because it's much less of a headache than coding in assembly. Before. So I just kind of drifted into doing that, and then I was just ended up as a full-time artist working on lots of different games, 8-bit, 16-bit, right up through until we formed Media Molecule. Really, I was a professional artist, really, and I'd get still within that. The other skills were very useful, like the programming background meant I was quite the more sort of technical side of the art, which obviously became more and more important as we go on. I was very good at that, but yeah, animation, all that sort of stuff, and I could talk to programmers because I understood how programs work and how code works, so I could describe things in a way that I know would make sense to them. But but art was just easy for me, and programming I have to really think about, and it's a bit more headachy. So I was like, okay, and that's before you even get to the process of working on a team of programmers, and you've got all your source control, and who touches what in this code, and then the arguments over like what's the rules for comments, do we use this format, that format, and all this sort of thing. And it's I'm very anal about that sort of stuff, so I don't get ever to concede. So yeah.
So that's a superpower in game development studio, I think, to have somebody who is on the art team who knows how to talk to programmers. I think it's rare in this direction, because it's often that like artists are focused on the digital art itself, and they're kind of in their world, and programmers are not the easiest to talk to. So you have these like two groups that don't want to do.
You've got the left brain, right brain sort of thing going on, haven't you? Your coders and engineers tend to be much more sort of logical and, sort of that kind of, that's the way their brain is wired. Whereas on the creative side, you've got the more sort of airy-fairy kind of, there's not really a way to describe this thing, but, it's all about the feeling and blah, blah, blah. And it's quite rare. What often causes a lot of clashes when you get those two brain types talking. But then you do get the people that are sort of a good mixture of both. I like to think that I can use both sides of my brain like that. And again, Alex, the programmer that I was working with, he's, is literally the most amazing technical programmer I could ever imagine existing. But he's also actually very artistic as well, which is quite very rare in an engineering type person, I think. So he could accept the sort of vagueness of artistic sort of endeavours and things as well, and embrace that. And so that's why working with him at Media Molecule was such a good combination, I think. But yeah, you're right. I mean, you do get people that are technical artists, so I imagine they're sort of try to be a bit more on that side, don't you? But yeah, when you get your real, genuinely brilliant concept artists and things like that, they're like, well, why can't I put this texture in that's like 6 million pixels by 6 million pixels, for example, and that sort of stuff. So,
at what point do we get to Bullfrog and Dungeon Keeper? How does it happen?
Yeah, so I did that game for Codemasters, and then I ended up doing a bunch of educational software, funnily enough, called Fun School, and Paint and Create was another thing that I did, which was like based at young children and the curriculum, but turning it into little mini games. And that was a good sort of like apprenticeship for me, because I had to do lots of little games very quickly, so I improved my programming skills then. But then someone that was doing the Spectrum versions of those got in touch with me and said, look, why don't we form a team and do this as a sort of team? Because it was for a company called Europress, and they were just speaking to us as individuals. And he was a much better businessman than I was. So we sort of did it as a team with a few other people and managed to charge Europress a lot more money, basically. And that was when I started being more focused on the graphics. They're like, well, look, we'll do the programming, you just do all the graphics. So I was doing that for quite a while, and we ended up as a small team that did a bunch of different sort of work for hire type jobs. We did some 8-bit sort of conversions. We did like a Sleepwalker game, which is like some sort of comic relief type thing. We did a conversion of that to the Commodore 64. We did like a game called Hook, which is based on a film about Peter Pan. Did the Commodore version of that. A few different things, but it was quite a sort of hand-to-mouth type operation, I think. And then as it got towards the sort of 16-bit consoles kind of starting to take over a little bit from the home computers, the whole thing just kind of fell apart, basically. And then I managed to get a job at Bullfrog, basically. I registered with a couple of recruiters, which is a whole other story, actually, which is quite fun. I ended up actually getting a job at a company called Argonaut, what were they called? Bits Interactive, just down the road from Argonaut Software. I got a job there for a little while, but that was a disaster because I was still freelancing, doing something else, which meant I was working at their office during the day, and then at night I was getting a train to go to this other office, doing some work there, and then sleeping on their floor, and then going back. That lasted about 2 weeks, and it just completely destroyed me, and I was just like, I can't do this. And then I was at the other place, and I got this phone call from somebody pretending to be my girlfriend. And I'm like, they're like, oh, your girlfriend's on the phone. And then it was this voice I didn't recognise. And she says, oh, hi, it's actually so-and-so from the other recruiters, the ones who didn't get you the placement where you are now. We've managed to get you an interview at Bullfrog, who I actually wasn't really aware of, And they're like, are they good?
Wait, like, why did they pretend to be your girlfriend? What?
Well, because if they had a recruiter phoning up to speak to one of their employees, they'd immediately assume that they're trying to be poached or something, I suppose. So
okay, yes. Okay, yeah. Wow.
So it was all a bit cloak and daggers kind of thing. But she said, oh, Bullfrog are amazing. This is when they were really, I think they'd just released like Populous or something like this, and Syndicate, all this kind of stuff. So they were sort of like the sort of darling, industry darlings at the time in some sense. So I went there, had my interview, got a job there, and it meant I could start in about a month's time, which actually gave me some time to sort out all the chaos in my personal life. And I rocked up there, worked as an artist for I forget how many years, but quite a few years. First thing I did was the SNES and Mega Drive graphics for Theme Park. Actually, that was my task, and I remember I knocked them all out in about a week, and they were just like, oh God, we weren't expecting that. And actually really cool. So then they put me onto other stuff, and it was I really enjoyed that. To me, actually felt like my first proper job in the industry, because up until then it was me freelancing from home, and then with that group of mates in a house in Lowestoft doing the work for hire stuff. It was all a bit unprofessional. Whereas this was like a proper job, and you've got a pension, and you're actually going to get paid at the end of each month, and this sort of stuff, which was like mind blowing. So I felt like I was properly in the games industry then. So that was cool.
Nice. When you did, because like the game development, it's a little bit different, for example, from just like software development, meaning that you have this project-based games and you're doing art, but at the same time the code and like audio and music, like they have different tracks, right? They have like different schedules, so you can be like done with the art for the game and then start to work on another project even though the game is not released, right? So this was how it worked back then.
Yeah, to some extent, like certainly back in the 8-bit days and the home computers, it would probably be a bit more like that, because it's rare that you'd have more than one artist on a project, for example, because there's just, there wasn't enough room to put that many graphics in, really. So yeah, quite often you could be sort of just do the graphics that are needed for that and then move on to this project. Certainly if it's a conversion or a game that's a known entity, we know what the game is, we know what we need, blah. But then when we get to the kind of Bullfrog era, because bear in mind, before that I was doing work for hire type stuff, so it was conversions of things that already existed, really. We did one original game, actually, Paint and Create, so I did a little bit of design on that. But really, it was not until I joined Bullfrog that I was in the realm of, like, this is a company that makes original computer games. And the culture there is not necessarily the same everywhere else around the same time, but certainly the culture that was at Bullfrog, and a culture that I particularly love and really worked well with me and actually sort of became the basis of Media Molecule later on, really, was we kind of made it up as we went along, is the short way of saying it. There wasn't like, right, here's a game design document for a game that we're going to make. We know we need these graphics and blah, this is the dialogue that's going to be in it, and some sort of blueprint. I think there's a lot of people that almost come into the games industry thinking that's kind of how it works now, and maybe it does in some sense, but I've never seen that work, and it's certainly not the way I enjoy making games. No, it was more that Peter Molyneux, who's the sort of creative director of Bullfrog at the time, it would be more like just a one sentence, like a vague idea. If you like Dungeon Keeper, it's a game where you play the bad guy. You control a dungeon and there's heroes coming in to steal your treasure. That was it. That was the game design. And then it just leave us just to go off like a very small team. There'd be like 2 programmers. I think on Dungeon Keeper it was literally like Simon Carter and Dean Carter, his brother, who later went on to do Fable. But there was him, and then I was an artist who was just there to sort of jam with them, really. So we'd have vague ideas of prototypes to make, and I would just sort of make what's ever needed for that particular prototype, very much thinking this is going to be throwaway graphics, really. It was just sort of like a jamming process. And then through serendipity and sort of happy accidents, you hit on different ideas that will take you off in a different direction, and slowly this sort of idea kind of forms. So in that sense, sometimes you don't even know what the final graphics are right until quite near the release date, really, because it's only then that it becomes clear what the actual game is. And then that's when the game design document might get done, like, right, here's what we've got to do to finish this thing and turn it into something. But up until that point, there's so much sort of jamming and going off in different directions, and that's what I love about making games, and that's how I like to make games, for sure. Very much like, if I'm having a jam with my friends and guitars and that, someone will just start playing something random, and we'll just try and join in, and at some point you might lock into some kind of groove and you've got something that's kind of cool, That's what I love about this sort of creative process.
How do you then evaluate these prototypes that you make during this creative process?
I mean, it's not like now. Like, if you're in a big... maybe indie teams are more like this now, but if you're on like a big 100, 200 person team now, there's lots of pre-evaluation before prototypes even happen. They'll be like, what's the target demographic, and is there a gap in the market for this type of thing, and what are the product pillars, and all this stuff that just happens in spreadsheets and things, which is complete and utter bullshit. I think I hate it, and it's just a waste of time, in my opinion. But no, the way that I like to evaluate, and that we certainly did back then, it was just the team playing it. You know, whoever's making it, are we enjoying what we're? It's like the target audience is ourselves. You know, we want to make something that we're into and that we're interested in. And oh, look, that thing happens when you do this. That's really funny. Let's make that happen more, and this kind of thing. So we're just. I mean, I wouldn't say it's selfish. I just think you're making something that you're into and that you love, and that is the way to do it, in my opinion. And then if other people like it, great, it's a bonus, you know. But at the very worst case there, if you make something that's a complete flop, if you've enjoyed doing it and you love it, then you've manifested something that you're into, rather than this piece of rubbish that not only do you not like, but nobody else likes. You know, that would feel like a waste of my life to spend something.
I would say there's a strong case that if you're liking it and also the other people in the team like it, then there will be people in the world that will like it as well, right? Like
that's what you would hope. And I think, you know, depending on the makeup of your team, obviously. I mean, if you've got like a spread of personalities in the team, then there's a good chance it's going to appeal to a wider range of people, I would argue. But yeah, I think that's totally the. I'm sure that all the music artists and things that I respect and love, that's how they would work. They're sitting there and it's self-indulgent to some extent, but that's kind of what art should be, I think, you know.
Now, we talk about we're at the Dungeon Keeper era, right?
Okay.
Do you have any?
I'm going to inspect my little timeline here. That was early 1990s, apparently. Yes.
Do you have some stories to tell from Dungeon Keeper or other Bullfrog productions that you worked on before you moved to Lionhead?
I mean, God. I mean, first of all, the culture at Bullfrog was amazing. I remember the first day I turned up, it felt like I'd walked more into like a circus training college or something. There were people walking around juggling. You know, there was this one guy who was actually a really good programmer, but he was a bit of a nutcase. He was almost completely naked, just had a pair of like those 70s kind of tight shorts on, sitting on a skateboard, rowing up the hallway with a baseball bat. It's like, what have I walked into here? This is crazy. And I remember I spent the first 2 weeks learning how to juggle, actually. It sort of felt like that was a requirement for some reason. So it was a very sort of creative and kind of crazy atmosphere. And yeah, I just think it was really fun. You know, I've got fond memories. I'm sure there were some horrible bits that I've managed to wipe out my mind, but I just really enjoyed that time. And it was kind of interesting, the whole Dungeon Keeper sort of development story, because we started that working in the company building. But then at some point, sort of about halfway through, Peter, who was the person that had, you know, founded Bullfrog, but had sold it on to EA, I think it was. So EA were the sort of new overlords. They actually kind of kicked him out and banned him from the office for some reason, because he was disruptive, or maybe they were having some argument behind the scenes. I don't know what was going on there. But he wanted to finish Dungeon Keeper. So we all ended up like leaving the office and going to work at his house and finishing the game there. So we felt like this odd little team. You know, he had a very nice house, so it was like out in the countryside. It was a nice atmosphere. But there's just a few of us in this room finishing Dungeon Keeper for about a year or 2 years or something.
Really?
So that was kind of unusual. So my journey from there to Lionhead didn't really feel like, I left Bullfrog and then joined Lionhead. It felt like I just carried on with that small team, because that was what became Lionhead, really. So it was no kind of intentional career planning or anything like that. It was just like, I'm just sort of going with the tide here, you know. But yeah, lots of fond memories, made some good friends, and and some of the people ended up working at Lionhead, which was Peter's next kind of thing.
And do I have the chronological order correct? This was after Dungeon Keeper. This was Black and White, the God game.
Yes, yeah, that was the first game we did at Lionhead, basically.
Okay.
And that was yeah, sorry, what were you going to say?
Because like it's interesting that now we're going to come back to this, but like Masters of Albion is kind of reimagination of Black and White, right? Like you have this like God game style where you're influencing various things that is happening in the village and around it. So
no, exactly. That's the in some ways that game, the new one, Masters of Albion, it's almost a kind of mixture actually of a lot of Peter's old best games. So it is it's influenced by Black and White, but also Dungeon Keeper, I would argue, and Fable a little bit as well. Although I never really thought of Fable as Peter's game, although he was heavily involved in it. I always think of that more of Simon and Dean Carter's game. But anyway, that's the sort of games that Bullfrog and Lionhead were famous for. So it is a sort of munging together of all of those things. I think Peter sees it as his like final little swan song and his chance for redemption, possibly, because he's managed to annoy a few people in the more recent years. But so I think he wants to sort of go out on a good one if he can, because he's getting on a bit. Although, I can't imagine him ever stopping making games, to be honest. He's another rare kind of character in that he's genuinely passionate about games. He loves games. It's not just like some business endeavour for him. Well, that's the impression I get anyway. And so it's nice to be working with someone or be led by someone that's a genuinely creative person. Because I have experienced the opposite of that, working under people that call the shots, that are just very much production timetables and target demographics and all that kind of stuff, and it makes me shiver in my soul.
What can you tell me about the Black and White development?
So when we started at Lionhead, again, it was a tiny team. There was myself, Peter, Demis Hassabis, who's now very famous for the Deep Mind stuff. He was, so I was working with him. He was a games programmer at that point. And actually I always remember being very unimpressed with this fireworks routine. We had this he had to do this fireworks thing for this prototype that we were doing, and I just thought, that's so bad, I could program that better than him. And obviously he turned out to be a complete genius, overlord, AI, Tyrell Corporation dude or whatever. But so I was in a little tiny room with him and Peter and who else was there at the start? A couple of Steve Jackson, who was very famous for Games Workshop, and a couple of other people. But we were a tiny little team, and there was basically 3 game ideas that kind of got pitched, and we sort of, as a small team, we decided which one we wanted to do. And there was one that Demis actually had pitched, which was called Republic or something like this, some sort of big city simulation type thing that he was writing to. And then Peter's main idea, and the one that we ended up going with, was, it wasn't called Black and White at the time, but the way it was pitched was basically Tamagotchi on steroids. And Tamagotchi were these little small electronic pets that had just come out. So it's like a little thing, and you had to just remember to keep feeding it, and you could, give it a little bit of love or tell it it was naughty. And if you didn't give it attention, they would die, basically. So it's just very simple little electronic toy. But that key idea of having a sort of pet, if you like, that you could nurture, was the thing that really certainly excited me about that project. I'm like, this is definitely Tamagotchi on steroids. That's a fantastic idea. And it was an excuse for AI to be used in the mix as well. But interestingly, Demis left actually quite soon after that. I think he was annoyed that his idea didn't get chosen or something, and he went off to do a games company, I think, before the whole AI stuff. But so we just got stuck into that, And it was like, I was just really into this idea that you'd have this creature that slowly grows and learns from how you reward it and all that kind of stuff. And it was, we just got stuck in. And again, that was the idea, that was the design, just those words really. So like, well, we need somewhere for this creature to live. What do these creatures look like? At first we tried like a human type thing, which just felt really wrong and ridiculous. We went with the animals, and we slowly sort of built this thing up, and it took a lot longer than it was hoped it would take, but it was very much, let's make this up as we go along. And I think when we finally finished it, I think it was reasonably successful and got lots of acclaim, and lots of people loved it. So it was good.
Somewhere nearing the end, Alex Evans joined, right? Or Black and White? Yeah,
well, so Alex had actually been at Bullfrog for a little while. I think he might have just been there for work experience for a short while. So he already had a bit of contact with that group of people. But then he came to join Lionhead as a, I don't know what his role would have been, like graphics programmer or something, I suppose. And I sat next to him actually in the office, and I kind of struck it off with him. I really liked him, also because I could ask, because I was still interested in programming, although I'm working as an artist at that time. I still would do like my own little personal dabblings, and I could ask him, and he had really nice ways of explaining things to me that were like very simple but actually really clever. And we just got a good working relationship because I had the sort of more technical art side. So he would often ask me to do some graphics for one of his demos, for example. He was quite into the demo scene, which was like people flexing their skills. Basically, it's like, look at this amazing thing that I've managed to make work in 1K or whatever. That was when I kind of first met him, really, and we started working quite a lot together. We became a little bit of a cliquey team, I suppose.
When you have been working on Black and White, you were working as an artist or more like an art director? What was
artist? Yeah. So funnily enough, we started Lionhead, and I was the only artist. I was literally the first artist. So I was supposed to be the art director, I suppose. But I think this is when I'm quite a lot younger, and I think it's as we sort of took on more and more artists, I think it became quite obvious that I wasn't really the management type at the time anyway. I was more I just wanted to get really stuck into the actual art and the creating side. I didn't really want to be managing people. So we quite quickly took on a guy called Paul McLaughlin, who was actually the art director from Bullfrog. He came to Lionhead and he just sort of took over that role. He was just a bit older and much more sensible than me. So I ended up just working as a senior artist, or whatever you want to call it. But always getting stuck in with, even on Dungeon Keeper, I had ideas and design ideas that I'd managed to get into the mix. So I was always had an opinion about those things. But I was really just an artist.
2D or 3D then?
Both. I mean, it was, by that time, you're working with 3D graphics, but you've still got the 2D UIs and various icons and all that sort of stuff. So a bit of both. I can still push pixels if I want to. Even it's a very lost art now, I imagine. But back in the Commodore 64 days, you'd be making sprites using cursor keys to move around a grid, and you'd be doing anti-aliasing by hand, just like, I'm going to put that darker colour there so it looks a bit of a smoother curve. And I could do it very fast. The cursor keys on a Commodore 64 are not even very intuitive. There's not like up, down, left and right. You've got down and right, and then you have to press shift to go up and left or something. It's like, but that's just burnt into my fingers, those skills. But again, because of the technical side, and I embraced 3D. I remember dabbling with the very first version of 3D Studio way back in the day when that came out, and so I sort of grew up and absorbed all of that as it was happening. But it's more 3D by that point for sure, but quite low poly though. So quite often you could use tricks from the sort of 2D world that would translate nicely into the 3D world. So for example, this was actually at Bullfrog. You just remembered this. We did some game for like a cover disc, and one of the programmers had written this routine that sort of like scrolled a tunnel towards you, but imagine that tunnel's just made up of literally quads, so there's no like height or anything to it, it's just a flat tube. But I remember doing some graphics for it that made it look like it was actually had lumps sticking out of it and stuff, but just by doing little tricks with shadows and things, that was much more of a sort of 2D mentality, and it suddenly looked much more like a 3D game, even though it was still 2D textures. So I always did get a kick out of sort of trying to make things look more technically impressive than they really were, just by doing little tricks with the graphics and things. And Dungeon Keeper, actually, this is going back to Bullfrog again. Again, we had that was a 3D engine, but the walls and everything were sort of just quads, so it was very low poly. But the actual textures themselves that went onto those quads, I built those in 3D Studio, and then we just render them as a 2D texture. So you've got all the nice lighting and stuff. So it kind of looked a lot more 3D than it really was. I always got a kick out of doing that kind of stuff. It's less relevant these days now, because a lot of the computers can sort of handle just millions of polygons in that anyway. So there's quite often not a lot of room left for those little tricks. It's more, which is not a bad thing. That's a very geeky thing to like. It's you've got a lot more freedom with how you want things to look now. Whereas back in the days, the technical limitations were a big part of the definer of what you could do.
Now the complexity moved somewhere else, right? And then like these tricks now can be applied, but like on a different kind of level. Like now the realism is being pushed to the limits. So now like how much you can do there.
Exactly. And that's the sort of stuff that Alex was on the forefront of, like when we started Media Molecule, and towards the end of Lionhead, actually, he was very much into all the things that are taken for granted these days, but back then weren't really happening, like deferred rendering and just having depth of field in the shot and all the balanced lighting and all that sort of stuff. He was doing demos back then that kind of milked all that stuff, whereas now you can just press a button in Unreal or Unity and get that. But yeah, there's within his forefront and people that are graphics programmers now, there's still the bits that they're pushing further and further. Like I saw a few months ago the latest iteration of the Unreal Engine and the various things they're doing there with the I think they've done a bunch of things with the trees and how trees are done and all that sort of stuff. So it's incredibly cool. There's still a world there to be explored, but that's beyond my technical sort of programming skill. At least I can get into using it as an artist and still find ways to exploit things to look like there's even more shit going on. But in terms of the programming, no, my programming is not on that level. It's too much of a headache.
Now, we end Black and White. And the next project at Lionhead is Fable. Is this correct? Or
yes, kind of, in a very simplistic way. I mean, Lionhead was quite a sort of chaotic beast around that time, really, because we'd done Black and White. I think they did a Black and White 2, but I didn't really work on that. I was actually, weirdly, because I'd worked very closely with Alex, like I was saying before. Alex was clearly a complete genius, and Peter could spot that, and Peter would be keen to keep him there at the company, whatever the cost, really, I think. And Alex was kind of getting a bit bored, I think, and was thinking of moving on. And Pete was like, well, what would it take you to stay, And Alex was like, let me do my own project, and I want to work with me, which was great for me. So we kind of got put off into our own little room, and we were just sort of like making a demo, actually. It was an excuse for him to explore all the graphical stuff that he was into, and I could, give him graphics and things that would help show that off. And we actually ended up, he pulled in another programmer called Dave Smith, who Alex really admired because he thought he was a very good programmer. And I kind of stole Kareem a little bit for some concept-y type stuff. So we had this small little weird team within Lionhead. It was, filed under R&D, basically. And we actually ended up doing a demo called The Room, which you can find on...
I've seen it. I see you tweeted this. We need to put the links in the description of this video.
Yeah, so the graphical techniques and things that are used in there are way before their time. Really, it was amazing, and the way the portals worked. Still nobody's done any portals as cool as that, in my opinion. So it was this amazing sort of tech demo that we did, and it was useful for Peter, I think, because it was a way of flexing, Lionhead's technical prowess or whatever. But it never really turned into a full game. It could have done. But the main point is we were alone in our own little room for a good year or two, I think, while Black and White 2 was happening. And the whole Fable thing was actually... Lionhead had sort of grand plans of really expanding, and they actually took on another 2 outside teams, Lionhead Satellites, they called them, I think, at the time. One of them was... what were they called? Intrepid? Something like that, maybe? And the other one was Big Blue Box, which was the team that were making Fable, basically. So that actually started as this completely separate project outside of Lionhead, and that was led by Simon and Dean Carter, who were I'd worked with at Bullfrog on Dungeon Keeper. Simon, now I'm still in touch with him actually. He works at DeepMind at the AI company, and Dean does like indie games from America or something. But that was very much their thing. So these things were happening outside while Black and White 2 was happening inside. And I think there was also the movies, was another game that happened. There was a whole bunch of stuff, actually. Or was the movies Bullfrog? I forget, sorry. But at one point, it was like, right, these 2 games that are happening outside are sort of in a bit of a rut. Don't really know where they're going. They've got a very cool engine that you can run around a fantasy world, but the game idea was not really manifesting, I think. And it was a case of like, well, we're going to have to shut one of these down, and then the other one will bring them in-house and take it on and finish it. So that was what happened. We brought the Big Blue Box team into Lionhead. I don't know what happened behind the scenes there. I don't know if it was that Peter paid them off, bought their company, or God knows. But essentially we had this influx of this team now, and it's like, right, we're going to help them finish Fable. And this was still another year or 2 to go on it. So my role on that was very much more sort of like come on to help finish things, really. So I ended up doing a bunch of like spell effects, I think, or something like this. And my kind of biggest moment on there, if you like, was me working with Kareem and them deciding that they need all these like narrative cutscenes and an intro to the game, but there's only me to do it. And normally you'd have a team of people doing those sort of things, certainly these days. So we came up with the idea to do it with these like frescoes, which is like, Kareem would make an amazing painting that's telling the story, and I would just sort of pan the camera around and it would be done like that. And that came out really well, I think, and that made them very happy because it was a cheap solution that kind of still looked quite slick and deliberate. So yeah, that was my main role on Fable, really. But in terms of design and stuff like that, that was very much Dean and Simon Carter, I think, were the main leaders there. I think Peter probably injected the more like moral choice side of the game, and what you do affects how the world forms. I've got a feeling that was more his influence. I could be wrong there, though.
By the way, what kind of games do you like? The games you worked on, do you like them as a player? Like, did you play them? Or was it like you're so familiar with the project that like you don't want to touch that as a player?
I was certainly playing them during development, because that's, like I said before, that was kind of how we come up with the ideas, really. And even now, that's my main method of game design, is I'll just start something and then play with it and play it. And obviously early on there's going to be things that go wrong and bugs, but those are the things that often inspire me with ideas. To give you a very concrete example of that, actually, so towards the end of Lionhead, I was getting much more into the programming. I'm like, I really actually want to learn programming again. But when I first learned programming, it was, well, first of all, BASIC, which is an incredibly simple language, but very slow, interpreted. And then I learned assembler on the Commodore, which is much more hardcore, low level. and we get to like the end of kind of the Lionhead days, and I'm like, yeah, I want to have a go at making some games again myself. And C++ seemed to be the language that everyone was using then, so I'm like, okay, I'm going to learn C++. So I started making a little game just to teach myself C++, which ended up becoming a game called Ragdoll Kung Fu, which actually ended up being the very first non-Valve game that was released on Steam, which is quite a cool little claim to fame, actually, because there's obviously a lot of games on Steam now. But my actual point was the design of that game. Again, that wasn't like up front, I didn't know what I was doing with that. It was very much, I want to learn how to program C++, so I'm going to make a simple 2D fighting game like Street Fighter or something. Not to sort of put down Street Fighter, I'm sure it's, you know, very complex within its own way, but I can make something that just puts a couple of sprites on the screen and you just punch each other. That would be a good way to learn. So really it started off as just that. And then again, sort of halfway through development of that, Alex, genius programmer dude, looked at it and he just suggested, oh, you should put some ropes. Because I started putting little platforms in that you could jump on. He says, why don't you put some ropes in that you can swing across? And he gave me this little piece of code. It was probably about 20 lines or something. That was a little physics thing called Verlet integration. So it's a way of sort of doing like physics rods. You know, even I understood it. It was quite simple. It just sort of iterates over the points and drags them closer together. But the end result is you sort of connect these little rods and you can have like little things that look like ropes and stuff. So I remember he gave me that code and I took it to my house and integrated that. And I'd got it to the point where I've got like this big long string of, you know, ropes, which is like rods. And I could pick it up with the mouse and sort of swing it around and I could drop it. And I dropped it on the floor, and because it's actually lots of little rods and not a real rope, you know, it fell in a really weird way that almost made like a little matchstick man. And that just like, fuck, I could actually make my characters out of this rope, out of these Verlet things, and suddenly have this weird like puppet type things. So that was like a real flash of inspiration for me to suddenly turn this into an original fighting game. I'm like, I won't have any animation. They're just these weird rubbery stick men where you have to drag their feet around and make your own kicking and stuff like that. That will be quite funny. And so that's a perfect example of sort of discovering something in the act of playing with the code, if you see what I mean. And that's always been my favourite way. And how did we get onto this subject? I've completely forgotten. Sorry, I'm just mumbling now.
Because I asked, like, do you play these games that you that you work
exactly.
on? Yeah,
so definitely, if I'm working on something, I'll be playing it all the time, just to sort of get a feel for what it needs and all that sort of stuff. But quite often, by the time you get to the end and it's released, it's very unlikely that I would play them, because you just know it back to front and you're kind of sick of it, really, because you've been playing it for like 2 or 3 years, you know. But interestingly, the first, you know, case of that where that wasn't the case was LittleBigPlanet. When we did LittleBigPlanet at Media Molecule, that was very different because, you know, it embraced this idea of user-generated content. So it was really exciting to go and play and experience what other people were making with it. So that was a very different thing. But yeah, up until that point, no, I wouldn't really play the game after it was released, because you're sort of bored of it, or you're on the next, you know, you're making the next game. And actually, I don't know if I'm normal here, but I've got a feeling a lot of people are like this, that work in game dev. I don't actually play a lot of games. I was never really that big a gamer. I was much more interested in making them than I was playing them. You know, I would play some, but much more social. It'd be like, if I'm with some friends, we'll play something together and it's a good laugh. Or if there's anything that came out that was particularly original or felt like it was, you know, pushing the frontiers, then I'd take a look at that. But as a general rule, I don't spend a lot of time playing games at all, because I spend most of my time sitting in front of a screen making stuff. I don't want to, you know, it's like working in the chocolate factory and then going home and eating chocolate. You're probably sick of chocolate, you know. You need to do something else, like go for a walk or do some exercise. Or so yeah, I don't really. And if I do play games nowadays, it's much more likely to be like old school, like arcade games and things. I've got like a arcade cabinet upstairs and it's got like every emulator on it you can imagine, so it's like the history of video games right up until, like, you know, the sort of Dreamcast, early PlayStation. it's got 100,000 games on there, literally. So it's quite interesting just looking back at some of those. But in terms of modern games, I mean, I think the last thing I actually bought was, I've got it down there actually, Death of the Reprobate, which is like a indie game written by this one guy. It's sort of quite an old school, point and click adventure type thing, but it just really appealed to me because it's got very crude humour in it, which appeals to me. It's very funny, like Monty Python style, and I thought it was actually quite genius what he did with the graphics. He actually used Renaissance art, paintings and things like this, but sort of cut out the characters, and the whole world is made up out of sort of clip art of Renaissance art, essentially. I thought that was a really very original thing to do, and it looks kind of cool and it's very funny. So yeah, something like that stands out to me. But certainly all your big blockbuster games that come out now, on the PlayStations and all that, they just don't really interest me, to be honest with you. My son, he's got the PlayStation upstairs and he plays them, but not me.
We record this like less than a week since Mugenics released. Have you played Mugenics, maybe?
No. I saw my son has been playing Ark Raiders. That was fairly recent, I think.
Yeah.
But no, what's that game then? I don't.
Mugenics is like the Edmund Macmillan, who made Binding of Isaac, and Tyler Glyle. They made for the past six years. They've been making Mugenics, which is like a D&D style cat breeding game where you take cats on adventures. They have various abilities, skills. They can have like they can have negative and positive effects accumulate during the adventure, and you need to like tactical RPG style win battles, and then you use those cats to breed other cats in your home for your adventures.
That sounds mental. Yeah, I like mental things for sure. Maybe I'll have a look at that. Is that like a single player thing or multiplayer?
Yes, single player. Yeah.
Yeah, interesting.
So now we are very close to the beginning of the story of founding Media Molecule.
Okay.
We've already mentioned that there were suspiciously 4 people who then became co-founders working in a single room.
Yes, exactly.
At Lionhead with Alex leading. And Alex pushed me to question you about the story, like full story. Like he told me that there's like a Steam/Valve arc involved. Like there's, I think, even like Jonathan Blow demo somewhere. Somebody showed somebody like. All of that like is involved in the story of founding Media Molecule. So this is what Alex told me, and I'm supposed to ask you all about that.
Okay, well, so towards the end of Lionhead, like I mentioned earlier, I'd been, learning to program, and I made this kung fu game, Ragdoll Kung Fu, and I'd actually made a video of it, which they published on the Lionhead website as like, here's this little project that one of our team is making, isn't it funny or whatever. And Jonathan Blow, who at the time was, he's an indie developer himself, but he was also the person that organised this event at GDC, Game Developers Conference in San Francisco, called the Experimental Games Workshop. And he'd seen this video. Actually, before we even get to that, there was a bit of a hoo-ha because lots of people saw this video and assumed it was actually the next Lionhead game. So I actually got in a bit of trouble. Got in a bit of trouble for that. Obviously, it wasn't. We had to explain, no, this is just this personal project of one of our crazy artists. But anyway, because of that, Jonathan Blow had seen this thing, and he basically wrote to me via email. I think we had email at the time. It must have been. To invite me to go to San Francisco to the Experimental Games Workshop and show my game. I'd never been to GDC. I didn't know what that was. Certainly not the Experimental Games Workshop. And I kind of, in my head, it was going to be like a small room with, 20 people in there just sort of showing each other their wacky little projects that they're making and just, a bit of a chinwag with each other. But I remember turning up. GDC is like huge, it's like thousands of people there, and then the Experimental Games Workshop was in this room, and I remember looking through the door and thinking, shit, there's at least a room, there's probably like 500 people that can fit in here. And I hadn't planned a presentation or anything, there's like this stage which I was going to have to go and stand on. So I was really like started panicking. So I remember I was literally sitting outside with my laptop like, oh, fuck, what am I going to say? And I gave up, and I'm just going to show the game to the people sitting in the room like I would show anyone else. So it was very much winging it. But I showed the game, and it went down a storm because it was a bit off its head, It got everyone laughing, and it got a bit of a standing ovation. I was blown away. I was like, oh, this is nice. But interestingly, and most relevant to this story, is that in the audience were a couple of people from Valve who were just in there, watching, and they came up to me afterwards, and they said, oh, we've got this thing called Steam, we want to start releasing third-party projects on it and things. Will you be our guinea pig, essentially? And I'm like, yeah, sounds cool. They're like, well, okay, tomorrow can you come over to Seattle to meet Gabe Newell, who's like, very famous character in the games industry, but I'd never heard of him because I live in a bubble. And Alex was like, Alex, who's the person who knows everything, he's like, yeah, say yes, just go. That's Gabe Newell. He's like one of the original founders of Microsoft or something. He's like a big fish, So off I went the next day to Seattle, turned up at Valve, managed to lose my wallet along the way somewhere. So the first thing I say when I get there is like, oh, this is really embarrassing, but can you lend me some money because I've lost my wallet and I'm not going to know how to get home again, which they were cool about. But yeah, I showed the game to Gabe Newell, and he was like, yeah, this is great, Doug, do a deal. And this was a guy called Doug Lombardi. I don't know if he's still at Valve, but he was their sort of business acquisition guy or something, I don't know. And he just said, yeah, we'll give you $10,000 up front or something, and a royalty, yeah, sign here. And I was just like, whoosh. So I never imagined I was even going to finish it as a commercial game, I just sort of thought this sounds like cool. And then I remember going home and actually panicking, thinking, shit, I'm actually going to have to finish this thing now. But I did, I finished it. I had a bit of help from Alex and Dave along the way. Alex kind of redid my graphics engine, which was incredibly basic, because I remember I used DirectX, I think it was, I was using to put all the sprites on the screen and stuff, and it was horrible learning that. The documentation for it was just like every word was a link to another page. It was just so impossible to understand. But Alex rewrote what I had done in like 20 minutes. I'm not even joking. He just went and he gave me this thing that now you could move the camera around and look at different angles and blah. So and then Dave basically helped me do the multiplayer side of it, because you could play multiplayer on. Does the microphone still work? I just hit my mic. Yeah, he basically integrated multiplayer for me, but very quickly, again, because my programming was so simple and my code was it's quite neat, because I have to write it in a way that I can understand. And because there was no dynamic memory allocation or anything like that, they were like, well, this is actually going to be easy. We just send across the whole fucking game state, which you've got in a big array there, and got that working really quickly. So they helped me finish up on that. But that became us almost working as like a little team together to get that out the door. And yeah, and that was literally the first official game that you could download on Steam that wasn't made by Valve, because I think before that they'd used it to sort of release updates of Half-Life and things like this. So that was really cool. And, obviously Steam now is like massive, isn't it? I mean, I think there's literally thousands of games released every month or something. It's like probably very hard to get noticed on there, I imagine. But for me, I was literally the only thing. So it was on the front page and everything. So yeah, I suppose the main point is that kind of experience kind of gave us, or certainly gave me the confidence for us to go off and actually do the Media Molecule thing. I mean, Alex was the sort of persuader, really, because he was like, well, I want to leave Lionhead now. Let's go and do our own company. And I was a bit in two minds. So I was like, well, I've got quite a cushy job here, sort of getting paid quite well. I'm going to go off on holiday and think about it. And this will be the bit of the story that Alex loves most, I think. But when I come back, he had basically handed my notice in for me. That's not even a lie. He's just like, right, we've left. And I'm like, oh, okay. We've got to sign this stuff. to give away our shares or something. And then he was like, right, we've got a meeting with Phil Harrison next week to go and pitch our game idea. So we need to think of something. And that was, so it was all a bit like, well, okay. But I was happy to go along again with the ride because I had a lot of faith in Alex for a start. I just knew he was amazing. And Dave actually, funnily enough, while I was doing Ragdoll Kung Fu, he had his own personal project, which was like this 2D, it was like a 2D physics engine, I suppose, how you would describe it. I think he called it, what did he call it? Some name he had for it. It's completely slipped my mind, like bits or blocks or something. But basically you could just make thousands of little 2D blocks and they'd all collide with each other nicely. So we had this kind of like really cool little physics engine. There's no game in it, it was just literally that. And we sort of got together to talk about what can we do for this demo, for pitch to Sony, for them to fund us doing something. And we sort of combined Dave's engine and we took out some bits that we liked from Ragdoll Kung Fu. So one of the things about Ragdoll Kung Fu was that my selling point was that you could act in emote with it, which was a way of, there was no animation, you had to animate it yourself. You could grab the character's hand and wave it around, or you could grab their head and blah blah blah. But it was quite a fiddly thing to actually control. It's actually quite hardcore. It's quite hard to get good at. But we liked that general idea that you could act in emote, essentially, as a sort of headline. And then the other thing within Ragdoll Kung Fu that ended up being very popular was the fact that people could make their own characters. Because it was just on a texture sheet. There was like a head, bits of arm here and stuff like this. And I exposed that so people could just bring in their own textures and make their own like 2D silly characters. And that was really popular. People really loved that. So we thought we want some element of that where people can create their own content to put in the thing, So we had those ideas, and then we sort of transposed that onto Dave's physics engine, and he made this demo called Yellowhead, basically, which was like a little 2D character running around. You'll find that online if you do a search on YouTube for Yellowhead demo. That's the very first prototype of LittleBigPlanet, actually. So the acting and emoting became just like holding the stick down and you could move the arms around. No, I think he had an arm on each stick originally, so you could just move the arms around. But the point is to generally run around and jump was very much more traditional console controls, like use a stick and press X to jump rather than having to literally pick up the feet with a mouse and stuff. So it was like a sort of simplified version of that. And we had that demo, and we basically, instead of doing a PowerPoint presentation of quite often teams would do if they're going to go and pitch an idea, we put everything into this 2D demo, so you actually run around and anything that we wanted to say was in the background and you could pull it around, and it was a really kind of fresh, original way of showing off what we wanted to do. So we had this meeting with Phil Harrison, who was the Sony dude at the time, and he loved the demo, and Alex managed to impress with like the technical side of things, saying, oh yeah, apparently the PlayStation 3 has got, I think it had multiple cores or something, and he had all these different ideas for how he could milk that and speak all the technical speak that would impress the technical people in the room. And because the Ragdoll Kung Fu thing had just come out, that, we could say, look, we've just made this. We're experienced at making games. We don't quite know what we're going to make yet, but we're very good at it anyway, so trust us, we'll do something cool. Just give us some money for like 6 months to make a demo. And we ended up spending about 3 hours in that room. It was supposed to be a half-hour meeting originally, but it just went super, super well. And basically they agreed to fund us for 6 months. I think it was like 250 grand we wanted or something. We got some really cheap, crappy offices in Guildford above a bathroom showroom with a leaky roof. Got our paint tins out and painted it up. I was making the desks. I went down the DIY store and I bought some like kitchen worktops and some wooden legs, and I was making the desks and everything. It was all very lo-fi, low-key. But yeah, we basically turned that sort of 2D demo into a 3D, what became LittleBigPlanet, basically. And by the end of that 6 months, we had a really good quality demo. We'd managed to pull a few more people in. Kareem came. He was there from day one, really. But and we got a few other people, and that demo was what we ended up showing at GDC, actually. So this was my return to GDC after the ragdoll thing. This was like a step up, because when we showed that in the keynote, funnily enough, it had some echoes of my ragdoll experience. Actually, again, that was like, okay, we want you to be in the keynote of the Sony thing. We turned up as our small team, and again, it was like, let's look through the room where this thing's going to be. And this time it was like, looked like 10,000 seats to me. I don't know how many it was, probably a few thousand, but it was huge. It really reminded me of a scene from Lord of the Rings, when, like, Sauron is looking over his like legions or whatever. It was just like these seats that go off into the fogged distance, and then right in the distance there's a stage, and they'd made all these like big props from the game, and we were like, shit, they're really taking this seriously, and we're going to have to go and stand on that stage tomorrow and show our game. And we went into panic mode again. But luckily, well, we were kind of the attitude of like, well, we'll just wing it. But the Sony producers at the time was Leo Cubbin and Pete Smith, and they were on our case basically. They're like, right, no, we're going to go in a hotel room tonight and we're going to rehearse exactly what we're doing. And they forced it to so thank God they did, because it would have been a disaster otherwise. So we really honed down what we were going to do, and you still end up winging it a bit on stage anyway, because you forget, but we had a rough plan. But again, that was a standing ovation that just went so well. And after that, we hadn't even finalised our deal with Sony at that point, actually, that they'd agreed to fund the rest of the game. So technically, we could have like gone to another company, really. Although they probably owned the work that we'd done, but we did get approached by Microsoft around about that time, because I don't know if they caught wind of the fact that we weren't actually signed to Sony or anything yet, and they sent in this guy to try and sweet talk us and sort of get us to sort of jump ship and go with them. Actually, it was all a bit cloak and daggers type stuff, but I was very against that, because I'm like, well, look, they've been good to us, they've funded us to this point. It would just feel so morally wrong to do something like that. So thank you, but no. Yeah, and then obviously Sony were right into it, because it had been released to the public. It got really good response, and from then on we sort of became like their darlings, really. And we couldn't put a foot wrong. They just loved what we were doing. And then Sackboy ended up almost becoming like the mascot for the PlayStation 3. And in terms of a startup, this is the first time we'd done our own company. It was the dream, really. Everything went. There was stressful moments, like in any startup. You're going to have disagreements and feel like killing each other at one point because you're so invested in it and stuff. But no, it just went as well as we could imagine, really. And it was such a dream team of people. I had myself, Alex, complete genius, Dave, amazing programmer, with Kareem on the art direction side. We had an animator artist dude called Francis that we nicked from Lionhead. Brilliant. He's like Pixar, Disney quality style character. Rex Crowell, sort of more of an artist, designery type person, but he did a lot of the graphics and all the stickers, and just generally chipped in with ideas. It was a real like super group of people. They were like such amazingly talented people. So yeah, that's a very special time for me. And the game came out, and I think you could see everyone's personality in that game as well. It really shone through that it had a lot of heart and soul, I think. So it's fantastic. And we went on to win fucking hundreds of awards, literally. It was lost count. And I remember saying to Kareem at the time, because he was, although he'd worked at Lionhead a bit, he was kind of a bit fresh within the games industry. And I was like, dude, this shit never happens. Don't take this for granted and think this is normal. You've got enjoy this while it's happening. Do you know what I mean? Because it's the stars have aligned and we've hit the sweet spot. So keep your feet on the ground, but enjoy it. But don't take this for granted, man. And I think I was right about that. But yeah, so that was just brilliant.
How long was the LittleBigPlanet development?
I'm going to refer to my grok
Yeah.
summary here, because I actually can't. I mean, from memory, I think it was about 2 years or something like that. Don't know, it might have been longer or shorter. There was obviously the 6-month prototyping. I've got a feeling it was about another 2 years or a year and a half after that or something. Probably we missed the initial date and slipped by 6 months or something. Vague memories of that. But no, we were pretty tight on it. And yeah, and it was just... I don't know if it was immediately successful. I think it was fairly successful first on, but then it had a real spike when there was like something else had happened in the world and lots of people suddenly got into it a lot more or something. But yeah, it was about... We actually sold the company to Sony literally about 2 or 3 years after we formed it, I think, which would have been just after the finishing LittleBigPlanet 1, I think. So yeah, it was quite quick. It was quite a high process.
Can you tell me a little bit about this acquisition? Is it, or as far as it is, like, as far as you can talk about this, like what would be what would be the reason to do it? If you have a kind of darling studio, people want you to keep making games, why would you sell off the company then?
Yeah, well, I mean, in hindsight, maybe I wouldn't actually. I don't know, but well, no, actually, in double hindsight, I think it was definitely the right thing to do. But when we get to dreams, but no, at the time, because up until this point, although I was getting paid quite well at Lionhead and things like this, my background, the background that I come from, is very working class or social security class, I'd call it, or whatever. When I was a kid, my family wasn't very wealthy at all, and I relied on free school meals from the state and stuff like this. So wealth wasn't within my family, basically. Me being a successful artist at Lionhead and everything was like, I was the most successful financially person within our family for as far as you can trace back, probably. I don't know. So it's a rare thing, but I was very conscious of that. I definitely didn't take it for granted. And then when the question of acquisition came up, because we had a business dude as part of our team, Chris Lee, really nice guy, and that was kind of his thing, really. He would help teams. Initially, he might put in a bit of funding or whatever, but then very much with the idea that, like, to sell a company off at the end of it and make more money or whatever. That's his kind of model, I think. So it came up, it was him that put it to us first, that Sony have offered to buy the company. And I was like, well, that means I'd suddenly become a millionaire or something, doesn't it? Which is like, it was beyond my wildest dreams and just not ever entered into my world. And I'm like, we've got to say yes, this is the once in a lifetime opportunity, And I remember getting advice from some other people that had formed their own company, who were ex-Lionheaders. They'd gone off to do, what was their company called? I forget what their company was called now, but the game they did was sort of like a sim game in space, Startopia or Utopia or something like this, I can't remember. But anyway, they had reasonable success, and they were offered a buyout from Activision or someone at the time, and they'd turned it down. They were like, no, we don't want to be owned by you corporate fucks or whatever, we're just going to be independent. And then within about a year, they went bankrupt, and the whole thing went tits up. So the guy from there, a guy called Gary Carr, his advice to me was just like, take it while it's on the table, because, things can go wrong very quickly, and then before you know it, you're like just back on the job market looking for another job. That's like a once in a lifetime thing. So I had that in my mind, and I'm like, yes, we're going to have to take this. But also because LittleBigPlanet had done so well and was doing fine, and Sony loved us, I'm like, well, the best time to sell something is when you don't need to sell it, because you can ask for whatever you want, and if they say no, then you're like, well, it's not for sale then, I don't care, we'll just carry on as we are, thank you very much. So it just felt like this is the right time to at least entertain the idea. So So obviously Chris Lee was very into the idea because he's a business development person. That's their main thing, really. I was certainly into it because I'm like, you know, I grew up in a council estate. This is like the wild dream for me, the idea that I could be a millionaire. Fuck yeah, let me have some of that. Kareem didn't need much persuading, for example. The other main shareholders would have been Alex and Dave, and then a couple of other people had some smaller shares, like Francis the artist and Siobhan, who was like the kind of producery person. And basically, we come up with a strategy. This is probably naughty stuff, I don't know, but it's so long ago, I'm sure it doesn't matter now. But me, Chris, and Kareem were like, right, we've got to persuade the others to be into this idea. So what's the plan of attack? What's the battle plan? First of all, we're going to go for Alex. I know I can persuade Alex and convince him it's the right thing to do. And then once he's on board, the rest will be easy, sort of thing. So we had this plan of persuasion. It wasn't, you know, quite as cloak and daggers as that sounds, but you know, I think at the time Alex might have preferred to stay independent, for example, just because he's like, no, well, we can build the company up more and make it more valuable, or do our own thing, blah blah blah. But I'm like, man, this is once in a lifetime opportunity. Let's do it, and we can ask for what we want. They're going to leave us alone, blah. So anyway, we did that. We did the whole thing. Got a lump of cash. So for the first time in my life, I was like, what, I can buy a house. I'm going to pay off my mortgage and have a house and not have to worry about the mortgage. Fantastic. Treat my family, do all the sort of things you dream of when you get a lump of money. You know, they say money doesn't make you happy, and that's true, but it does put a smile in your face for at least a little while when you first get it, you know, and it makes a bunch of things easier. So that was cool, but most of all, we regained a lot of creative control. There was like, okay, we'll do this thing, but we don't want to be in a situation where you're dictating what we have to make now. We want to do our own thing. I think I described it as like, you're allowed to have like this little letterbox in one wall that you can speak through occasionally if you like, but other than that, you leave us to our own devices. So we did that, and then we did LittleBigPlanet 2, and it was all great. And for me, it was ignoring the money side of things there, just from the sort of creative side. It sort of took a bit of pressure off, because like we haven't got to worry about trying to find the next publisher for the next game, you know, which is a whole episode of different shenanigans when you're going through all that sort of stuff. I can just focus on the design of the game, and Sony give us a bit of a cushion there in some sense. We can always be a bit more experimental, and if it goes wrong, who fucking cares? Sony's problem, not ours now, you know. That sounds a bit mean, but that's kind of one way of thinking about it. You've got just a bit more freedom to, and security, I suppose, is a better way of describing it, to explore. So we did the whole LittleBigPlanet 2 thing, and then we sort of decided to do something that was like more boundary pushing and blah. The whole dreams thing began, which turned into a much longer process than it should have done. But again, we wouldn't have done that if we were an independent company, I don't think. That was very much, right, we've got this comfort blanket of Sony, let's really try and push the boundaries here and blah. And yeah, so that was what we did. Unfortunately, that wasn't quite the commercial success that it needed to be to warrant the amount of money that was spent on it, because it was quite a long development. But technically and, you know, critically, I think it's an amazing piece of work. I stand by that. Certainly some of the graphical techniques that Alex was doing in the engine, and Simon was another. Even still now, you know, I look at things that people have made in dreams, and I'm like, fucking hell, that actually looks really good. You know, the lighting model and all that is very cool. So, but
so what was the?
We burnt a lot of rope. We burnt a lot of rope with Sony doing that, because we took a long time, I think.
What was the founding idea for Dreams? Meaning, like, what is the pitch? You know, like, you go from LittleBigPlanet to what?
Yeah, well, so I mean, to go back to LittleBigPlanet first, to give that a little bit of context, you know, our demo that we first pitched was very much like a 2D physics platform game with a small element of user-created content in it. Maybe you can design your own characters or something. But as we started developing that, I got really more and more into the idea of people being able to actually make their own levels and actually turning it into a full-fledged game design package, because that's something that I had always craved when we go back to the Commodore 64 days and I wanted to make games, before I learned assembler, I was just like, is there some package that someone's made that allows you to make games, you know? And the best at the time was a thing called Shoot 'em Up Construction Kit by Sensible Software, which was very tied towards making sort of these vertical shooter type games, which were quite popular at the time. But it had a sprite design package in there, and it had the scroll routines already, and you could just design the alien patterns by moving the joystick around. So it was quite a sort of user-friendly way of making a game. So I'd always craved for that sort of thing secretly. And then we were doing LittleBigPlanet. I think that craving got really sparked off of me. And I'm like, we can turn this into something where people can make games and share them with each other. Because that was the sort of cusp of consoles becoming online as well. So milking the sort of sharing stuff. So I was very keen into pushing that side of things. And actually, at the time, I remember someone like Dave would have been much more into like, no, let's just keep it as a 2D platform game with a little bit of create. And there was a bit of tension there. And what we ended up with was a good balance between the two, I would say. You could play it as a game, a standalone game. It was really good fun. Or you could use it to make stuff. And it was quite flexible what people could do with it. But because it was very much geared towards making sort of 2D platform games, people that did the unusual stuff had to use a lot of trickery and hackery to sort of, well, you think this is a game for making 2D engines, but look, I've managed to make a first-person shooter by tilting the camera and blah, and people would discover all these little things. So I thought, let's just really embrace with Dreams, and LittleBigPlanet was a perfect balance in hindsight, that was really good. But with Dreams, we're like, let's go the whole hog and really make this a much more flexible game engine that's still got the kind of console mentality in terms of usability, but allow people to really make any types of games. So it's like, let's make a sort of user-friendly version of Unity, basically, or Unreal or something. But crucially, put all of those different tools that you need to make games in one place. Because I mean, even with Unity and Unreal now, people would tend to use like, you know, a different 3D package to make the assets, or a different package to make the music. So having all of that in one place so that they can sort of also plug into each other, and then embracing this mentality of sort of like being able to create in a more expressive way rather than have to think about it kind of way. That was the sort of pitch, which is not an elevator pitch by any means, obviously. It's a very, you know, the elevator pitch would have been like evolution of LittleBigPlanet. We want to do the next evolution of that, basically. So that was the kind of idea, and we knew that we'd have to make some example content with it. Because with LittleBigPlanet, you know, a very dry way of describing that is you've got like a sort of a game creation kit, and there's an example of what you can make with that, which happens to be the single player story that you play through. And in LittleBigPlanet case, that was really popular with the Sackboy character. It was, you know, a known sort of format in a lot of ways, platforming. It just worked. With Dreams, because it was like a much more versatile type engine, we knew that the content that we give away with it, the example content, would have to be a lot more sort of diverse in a way, and sort of try and show off all the different types of things that you can make, which is what we did. But inevitably that content just didn't strike the same chord that the LittleBigPlanet did, primarily because of Sackboy, I think, is what it comes down to. The Sackboy was like a character that you can see on the front of the box. It was very popular. My mum loved Sackboy, you know, it just seemed to appeal to people, so that was people's way in. Whereas with Dreams, there wasn't an obvious sort of icon character like that to suck people into the content. I mean, I actually wanted to make Dreams based on LittleBigPlanet at one point, really, because I felt like it's crazy to leave the Sackboy thing behind. That's our most successful thing, really. I could have imagined Dreams, but with Sackboy at the centre of it. But I kind of I didn't fight very hard for that, but I was sort of pushed back against that, because it was like, that makes it feel a bit less serious and a bit too childlike somehow. We wanted this to feel a bit more highbrow, you know.
So you wanted to have like a character or more like a game path?
Well, I would have done both. I would have, you know, in some ways you could imagine Dreams as that would have been perfect, calling it LittleBigPlanet 3D or something. So it's, again, you could have done a platform physics type game, but embracing 3D environments a lot more. and you also used Sackboy as your cursor in create mode, essentially. So it would have felt like a genuine, literal evolution of Little Big Planet. And I think possibly might have given it more chance of success because of that, actually. But that's easy to say in hindsight. But yeah, that was the general thinking. Let's go the whole hog now. Let's make a proper games design package with cool music tools and everything. So that was what we set out on, and it was ridiculously ambitious. But because we'd earned a lot of kudos and rope with our Little Big Planet things, we were just trusted by Sony just to come up with another blockbuster, I suppose.
So what was the reception of Dreams in hindsight? For me, as an outsider, I'm into game development, but I always do this through PC. And Dreams being on console, on PlayStation, it was like a weirdly unique requirement that you need to go through PlayStation to do that.
Yeah.
No,
totally.
So how after you released Dreams, what was the reception, and what do you think could have happened if it was like adapted?
Yeah. So I mean, it got good critical acclaim. It got an Edge 10 out of 10, for example. And it was, I think people appreciated the sort of technology side of it because it was quite advanced, really. But it just didn't really, it didn't have that Sackboy character on the box to make you go like, oh, that looks cool, I want that, So it was a bit of a slow burner, and it was definitely a lot more advanced than Little Big Planet in terms of creation tools. So it was although we tried to make it more friendly and sort of lo-fi as possible, at some point you still need to get into the nitty-gritty of like, oh, how do I test this bit, and all this and blah blah. Ironically, the coding in it, which is all like very sort of like node based, under the skin of electronics, ends up becoming a bit more complicated than programming in assembler language, actually. So for people to make stuff in it, they had to be quite invested, and there were people that have been very invested, and people made some amazing stuff. They still do, actually. There's a hardcore group of people that make amazing stuff now, but it was definitely more geared towards a PC kind of market, I would argue, for sure. That would have made much more sense on the PC. And in fact, after the game was released and it wasn't an instant commercial success as Sony would like it to be, there was plans to expand. Like, well, how do we make this work? Well, we're going to put it on PC. We're going to add multiplayer, which was always supposed to be in there, but we never got around to it. And blah, then that will give it a chance. Very much, and Sony were very into that idea because you've got things like Roblox and Fortnite and all that, or Minecraft that, are very successful. The thing they sort of conveniently ignored, I would argue, though, is a lot of those games were slow burners. They didn't start off as instant successes. They took time to sort of become what they were, But I felt like, okay, this is the start, and we actually got it running on PC, which will annoy a lot of people, I'm sure. I've used Dreams on a PC with a mouse. We got that working. That was, first stab at getting it working. To get it to production quality is obviously a whole different ball game. But and we got multiplayer. Got the basics of multiplayer in, so people could start making their own things. So in my mind, that would have been given it a good chance of success, really. But through a series of mad Game of Thrones like kind of shenanigans and things within various corporate type moves that go on, it wasn't to be, basically, is the bottom line. I mean, I'd love to go into more detail about that, but I have to be careful because I could end up annoying some lawyers somewhere or something, probably. But so yeah, it's kind of a shame. I felt like it's a shame it didn't get, like, if I had the source code, I'd be so tempted just to sort of like give it to someone and go, there you go. If it magically appears on PC, that would be great. But I haven't got it, unfortunately. Although I've heard that there is someone that's they've managed to reverse engineer it somehow, and there is actually something being worked on that's going to be on the PC, but whether that happens or not, I don't know. But if it does, you know, I will secretly, not so secretly, admire it and give it the big thumbs up for sure.
Okay. When you look at the sort of LittleBigPlanet 1, 2, and then Dreams, there's this progression that we talked about, like into making. Is there something to be learned from this whole arc? Meaning, like, it's like a user-generated content style of games that got more and more advanced, right? Is this like a dead end, for example? Does it have to be on like multi-platform? Like, is this like style of making Dreams being, hey, let's make the best tools for the player to easily create games, like a trap? Like, what do you think, like from high level?
I mean, if I was going to do something like that again, for example, and I was to look at like what are the things to get right here to give this the best chance of success, is I think it's really important that because we were sort of, I think a lot of people like looked at Dreams and they, is this like a sort of a Unity Unreal Light, or is this a sort of game with some it was a bit of a middle ground. It wasn't quite clear where it was aiming. So I think it would be sensible to make that much clearer. And I was always much more of a fan of the sort of make it easy for anyone. So it needs to come in the sort of wolf's or the sheep's clothing of a fun game, really. So, you know, I love the idea of kind of opening people up to the idea of making games and things. I almost felt like that was my spiritual mission in life or something after LittleBigPlanet. And that's great because I get lots of people that write to me now that are in game dev and they say it's because of LittleBigPlanet and stuff like that. So I'm like, oh, cool, I've done something good in the world. I've made a difference, you know, that's really nice. But so if I was going to go on that track again, I can certainly think of fun ways to make tools that are cool to use, much different from what they were now. But I'd be very careful and put a lot of attention on making sure that the example content that comes with it is a good game also, that stands on its own two legs. Fortnite is the perfect example of that, I would argue, because Fortnite was not that I'm a big fan of Fortnite game or anything, but my son certainly was in his generation, and it's a massively popular game now, but there was a solid game there, was the point. And then the sort of create side is growing and crept in more and more, and people can make their own maps and games in there now, I think. But it had that foundation of a solid game, you know. So I think that's really important. So I would definitely get that bit right. And then sort of on the more technical side of things, I would, like, there's the LittleBigPlanet servers that just got shut down at some point because whatever reasons, but that was basically, you know, Sony's control. But for the community of people that still love to play that, that's heartbreaking. And there's, you know, years worth of content in there, and I think they actually managed to make a copy of the servers, and you can actually join LittleBigPlanet servers now if you know the right buttons to press and the right little things, you know. So there's a community of people that still do that, but it just felt terrible that something that's so kind of geared towards a community can be shut off with a decision like that, you know. So on a technical sort of standing, without really knowing what I'm talking about, I would make sure that the server and the sort of sharing side of it is very much in the hands of the community itself, if that makes sense. So allow them to spin up their own servers easily, or just make it something that isn't turnable off by someone who just doesn't care somewhere else, you know. If the servers die, or because the community has died, not for some other reason. So I think that would be really important to make sure that has got a sort of stronger safety net, for sure. But yeah, I mean, that would be my main. I mean, there's lots of little subtle things in terms of tools and all that sort of stuff, which is a bit more nitty gritty. But yeah, that would be my And you know, we're in a world of AI now, aren't we? So it's interesting to see where that goes. But I did see some demos or whatever of the, what's it called? forgotten what it's called now. I think it's related to the Google side of things, where they're like, I want to play a game where you're walking down a street being attacked by llamas or something like that, and then you can just play this thing for 30 seconds, but it's literally generating the images frame by frame, and it's obviously it's kind of technically impressive, but still a bit shit at the moment. But you can see where that's going. So, yeah, I don't know, a world now where like you've got some tool that lets you make games, people would be like, well, why would I bother with that when I can just type a prompt in or whatever? Which I'm not a fan of, by the way, I have to say. I mean, for me, the act of, creating stuff and making stuff by hand is more than just about the end result. It's the journey of actually making it is like, as important, if not more important than the end result, I think. So getting to some end result just by typing in a prompt, I feels very inhumane in some ways to me, and is, I'm like one of those people who wants to throw his clogs in the machine sort of thing, and it's just like, this is terrible, we can't be doing this, it's going to take away the artistry and destroy the human soul or whatever. But at the same time, I can embrace AI as well in my own workflow. For example, in the past we would have used Google to search for a bunch of images to make a mood board for something, to get the flavours. Like, we're going to make a game level that's set in Egypt, so let's get lots of pictures of Egypt and get some ideas and things. So in that sense, I can embrace AI as like it's a very fancy Google image search in some ways. I can find exactly what I'm looking for, and you can sort of use it to sort of iterate and spark off ideas for things, for sure. But in terms of using it to actually generate end results and end assets for things, I really don't like that world at all. It'd be interesting to see where it goes, basically, because I'm a big fan of organic intelligence, let's say, and sort of handcrafted the art. A lot of reasons why I would be into music or art or something is, it's not just that thing that they've made, but it's them as people and the story that goes with them, and that's all a big part of it, I think. So I think it's sorry, I didn't mean to go down that route, but it got me thinking. I just wonder if there's even place for something like a LittleBigPlanet or Dreams these days, when people would be much more keen to go for like, no, let's make it an AI thing where you can prompt the stuff instead of having to actually make it. I mean, maybe some halfway house between the two would be the ideal thing.
You have to consider like AI tools if you're thinking about making a next generation LittleBigPlanet / Dreams game maker, editor, UGC kind of like product. Like, you need to have this mindset. Anton Mikhailov worked on Dreams. Sent me a demo, Purple Pants, that you made of a guy. So, tell me about it.
So, okay, so that was so this is after that was some content that I made in Dreams, basically, as like, I'm gonna be a community person in Dreams, and what would I make? But not having lots of time to do it. And it sort of struck me that what Dreams could be cool at, and part of my motivation for wanting to make it exist in the world was for stupid, silly things to exist on consoles, because console games, I mean, you get indie games on the consoles more now, but you tend to think of them as like these big blockbuster games that have had, hundreds of millions now of budgets and these big blockbuster things. Where's the silly stuff, that like is ridiculous and actually you could find on PC in various forums and formats, but the idea of making that much more accessible to people was really appealing to me. So the Purple Pants thing was me sort of my attempt at doing something that was like memey or just stupid. It's like not a big involved budget game thing. It's just this stupid thing that, like, why would anyone make something so stupid it's funny? So it was just that. So it was supposed to be like the adventures of Purple Pants. It was just like the worst character design I could imagine, like a skinny guy in purple pants with black socks, which is like just really visually unappealing for some reason to me. So I thought I can do that, and put him in these stupid situations where he just meets these horrendous deaths. And that was, I think I did about 2 or 3 different ones, and I should have progressed with it. But that was, I suppose that was my attempt to sort of sow some seeds for people making meme-y type silly stuff. Is my ulterior motive there. But yeah, that's what that was.
Okay. Now, we kind of got to the end of the Media Molecule chapter, and then you go on to 22 cans.
Yeah, so not immediately. My actual kind of plan was to, I was at Media Molecule for a good 17 years, I think, which is a long time, and it's much more normal. You remember earlier on I said that we'd sold the company after about 2 years of forming it. So that's when most people leave companies normally, actually, after they've sold them. But I was, I loved what I was doing, and had a lot of freedom to sort of explore ideas. But I survived 17 years. I left in the end because the sort of corporate tendrils did their inevitable thing and just made it unbearable for a person like me who doesn't want to talk about demographics and pillars and all that sort of stuff. It's just not my thing. I want to go back to the indie way of making games, So that was my plan, really. I'm like, well, I'm going to leave there. I'm not a billionaire or anything, but I've got enough money to survive a few years without having to worry about food. So I've very fortunate position to be in, so I'm just going to indulge and explore my own little projects, and started making some indie type stuff. Taught myself Blender, for example, and because I was used to using 3D Studio or 3ds Max, whatever it was called up until that point, but once I'd left Media Molecule, I'm like, shit, you have to pay for this software, and it's bloody expensive, actually. And I'm like, 3D Studio was really expensive to subscribe to that, and I'm like, and it's actually a bit buggy, it crashes quite a lot, so do I really want to be doing that? So I'm like, no, I'm going to look at this Blender thing, which is free, and it's fucking brilliant. You boot it up and it's there, ready in a few seconds, rather than having to wait 10 minutes while it goes through all the bloat. And so I taught myself that as my new 3D package, and I thought I want to learn how to do multiplayer stuff in Unity, so I did a little multiplayer prototype. And I was very much in the mode of, like, I'm just going to make my own game. Maybe I'll make another a follow-up to Ragdoll Kung Fu or something like this, or whatever. I don't know, I was just going to explore the space sort of thing. And that's what I was doing for probably about a year or something. And I still am, actually, in some sense. But during that period, I was speaking to Peter, because I'd always kept in touch with him, so we would occasionally meet up and just hang out anyway. And he showed me what he was doing. And me being me, I can't resist, like, oh, that's kind of cool, but have you thought about, you could make this look a bit better, and maybe if we did it like this. And I couldn't resist doing like a little graphical demo for him, say, we could make it look more like this. And I got sucked into helping him out, basically. And at first I was just doing some graphics as like a freelance artist, really. And then one thing led to another, and they asked me to come on and be the art director to help finish the game, because their other one had to leave and stuff. So yeah, I just thought, why not? I've kind of got sucked in, and it also forced me to get back into the mode of actually being very productive. Because in that year, it was quite like, oh yeah, I'll spend an hour today doing some programming or art, but then I'm going to spend the rest of the day fixing that cupboard that needs fixing in the house, or or going for a swim. I like swimming a lot. So that sort of forced me to get into the doing a full proper day's attacking of learning stuff, and I was forced to learn the finer points of Blender through necessity and stuff like that. So yeah, I've kind of got sucked into doing that, really, and it's but I liked working with Peter because he's got that old school method that I like, of we're kind of making it up as we go along a little bit, which has its negative side. There's pain in the arse things that happen from that, because you'll end up just throwing stuff away that you've spent the last few months on, and but that's a creative process that I really enjoy, and it's the only one I know, really, so I like working in that way. So yeah, it's been kind of cool doing that, and it was an excuse to get Kareem on board and help out with some concepting stuff. You know, I say art director, it's a very small team. Really, I'm like a hands-on artist that's just a sort of go-to for the other artists if they're like stuck on something or whatever. So yeah, I like that it's very hands-on as well, actually, because that was another thing that sort of made me want to leave Media Molecule in the end. I've always, as a designer, I need to be hands-on making things. That's how I come up with my ideas, really. I can't sit there and just make a document for you that predicts everything. I can plan certain things, and it was just more about managing people and dealing with what felt like irrelevant meetings and things, and not being hands-on. So I love being hands-on again. That's what I enjoy doing. I just love it. I've even done a little bit of programming in the Peter's game, actually. Very simple, because there's like a day-night cycle in there. So I can do a day-night cycle, and I did a whole little code thing that moves the sun around and the moon and blah, and lerps all the colours and things. So it was an excuse to get my programming skills in there as well.
How big is the team?
I think, so there's like me, the artists is like me, Anna, Lee, Tom. There's probably about 6-7 artists at most or something, and then similar amount of programmers, and then Peter. So it's like less than 20 people basically. Yeah, it's small. Whereas Media Molecule, when I left, was like 200 people or something, I think.
Yeah. And Masters of Albion, which is the current game you're working on, is releasing soon, right? Soon-ish.
Apparently.
Soon-ish. So can we talk about that? Like, let's do a bit of a overview of the game and a bit of a sales pitch.
So, it's Peter's game. It's very much Peter's game. I will inevitably stick my oar in and throw a few ideas in the mix, but this is very much Peter's gig. And I think it's kind of, it's trying to be like a bit of a mixture of lots of his old best games, kind of like this is his redemption or his final swan song or whatever you'd want to call it. It's a chance for him to hopefully go out on a bit more of a bang than, because he's had a bit of controversy over the years and managed to annoy a few people and had a bit of a down period, I think. So I think he likes the idea of trying to redeem that in some way. But yeah, it's just, the cool thing is he pulled in like another guy called Russ Shaw on the sound, who I used to work with at Bullfrog and Lionhead. So there's a sense of like the old team is kind of back together, and it's quite nice in that sense to be working with people that I've got a lot of history with. And like I say, I like the way that we work. But I think it's cool. I think it's looking cool. I think it's going to be interesting how that release date goes. I won't say any more than that, because personally it would be nice if we could have a little bit more time to do it a bit more justice, I think. But then again, we're in a world now where you have like early access and stuff, and you can sort of add to it after. But that first hit has got to be really good. So it's getting there. It's cool, but I'm sort of looking at the calendar and thinking, fuck, that's fast approaching.
What's the release date exactly?
I think it was boldly stamped on the trailer of like April 22nd at like 10:05 or something split thing. And I'm like, don't do that. Just don't do that. You don't need to say the date. What's the point? We shall see. So yeah, April, sort of mid-April, end of April, something like that, I think. What are we now? January, February, coming up. So it's only a couple of months or something.
2 months, yeah.
So,
and the game is this like God game type where you have your healthy little companion, which is a hand, like a glove.
Yeah, so that's very much the black and white. That's the black and white influence where it's a God game. So your presence in the game, if you like, is shown as a hand that can, pick up people, and you can make buildings and move around the landscape, zoom in and out. And you've got like different powers that you can unleash, like fireballs and lightning hands and all this kind of stuff. So that's very black and white inspired. But then you can also possess different characters, like different heroes and things, which is much more dungeon keepery, where you could go in and possess the monsters and actually embody that character and then play it more like a sort of third-person action type game, or go exploring and stuff. So that's sort of like a Fable element coming into it, I suppose you could argue. So yeah, it's kind of just it is a mixture of all those different types of games. But the way I like to sort of describe it, or what I kind of, when Peter was talking about it to me, the way I described it back to him in like elevator-y pitch kind of ways, was like, okay, you've got this, first of all, there's this day-night cycle, which I really picked up on. So that's why I coded that and made it more of a thing. So I'm like, that should be a real thing. That should be this constant cycle that's going on. And you've got the kind of building godlike stuff that you do during the day, which you could argue is a sort of cozy type game. You know, there's a certain genre of game there that is quite popular with certain people, cozy type games. But I find them quite boring normally. I can understand the appeal of them, but when I've tried to play them, you know, I just get bored, and they need a lot of time put into them. I think that's the point. But I understand the appeal of it. So I'm like, that's cool. Embrace this sort of like cozy day-like experience, but then let's contrast that with something that's the complete opposite, and this complete extreme violence and chaos, you know. So suddenly the contrast of those two things really appeals to me. So I'm like, for me, this game is like cozy by day and chaos by night. That's my way of describing it, and that felt much more appealing to me. So that's how I would sort of describe it, is you've got your sim type stuff during the day. You can do the sim stuff at night if you want to, while all the chaos is going on, but you know, it's inevitable you're going to get distracted. So yeah, you can sort of geek out on just like building up your little towns and villages and things, and designing products. You can make cakes and weapons and stuff. But then there's this sort of like onslaught of creatures and things at night, and it becomes a bit more like a sort of tower defense-y, third-person action type brawler type thing at night. Yeah, don't know if that's a neat way of describing it, but that's how I see it.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, I have a couple of questions like for closing out statements, okay?
Okay.
I think we're reaching the end of the interview anyway. I wonder, you mentioned this a couple of times, that you like this process that is like not necessarily looking at target demographics and spreadsheets, but just like making it, right?
Yeah.
Is this also like a game industry shift that has been happening, that it's like more targeting the spreadsheets, or is it something that is like by necessity, like AAA games do that, and if you are indie, you don't do that? How do you see this?
Yeah, so I mean, certainly as budgets have got bigger and bigger on the AAA kind of games, I think it's by necessity in some sense, as in when you're spending, I mean, $200 million or something on a project, there's going to be people that, like, how certain can we be that this is a success? You know, let's do some research. Let's really try and make sure that we're going to hit a market that actually exists, for example. So I understand that, you know, and I wouldn't even knock it really. I don't like it. I don't like to be a part of that, but I can understand why that's important within that world. Because that's a lot of money, you know, which probably just gets written off against tax or something in reality. God knows, I don't know. But, when there's that amount of money, people want to be as sure as possible that they've got something that's going to succeed. But that can fail, obviously. You know, you look at Concord. Was it Concord, the Sony thing a few months back that was big budget kind of thing, and then it's released and it's pulled off market within a couple of weeks or something, and that's just horrendous disaster, really, I imagine. I don't know what the financial implications are of that, but so, you know, even when you do go that route, there is no way to predict that you're going to have a big hit game, I don't think, really. But I can understand why it's a thing and why they do it. But I wouldn't say that's a completely new thing, to be honest with you. There was always that flavour within the games industry. Certainly, even on the Commodore 64, towards the later end of the market, there'd be lots of, almost like cash-ins on film tie-ins and things that were like actually quite shit games, but they're like, no, this is a famous IP, so people are going to buy it anyway. Blah. There's always been that element of things. And then you also get lots of copycats. Like there'll be some indie studio that makes a game that's genuinely fresh and inventive, and then you get all the clones of that because, like, well, that game was successful, so we're going to make a game that's like that, which is the whole games as a service thing that's been happening and failing a lot due to, like, people look at Fortnite and go, well, they're fucking coining it in. We need to grab some of that action, but they're too late. You're too late by then. It's been done, and you can come up with something that is good and makes money, but even from a commercial sense, I'm just not sure that that's actually the safest route, really. It's frightening to think a couple of $100 million spent on a project like Concord, for example, could have funded like dozens of indie teams to make much wilder ideas, and one or two or three of those could have been something that's genuinely pushes the boundaries of what you think of as games and things. So for me, that would be a more commercial, sensible thing to do. But yeah, certainly within the indie world, you tend to get people that are more into experimental stuff, I think, and so that's what appeals to me now, for sure. So I think it is maybe it's a bit more polarised now, but I think there's always been an element of that to some degree, to be fair. And you get that within all media industries, don't you? You look at the music industry, there'll be a band that does really well, that's fresh and original, then there'll be all the copycat type bands that do the same sort of records. So it's just and again, I'm sure someone like Ed Sheeran has probably sat in a room with marketing people and they're like, right, who's your target demographic? Your next song needs to hit this point and strike this emotion, do you know what I mean? And how much he embraces that or not, I've got no idea, but so it's not unique to the games industry, I'm sure.
Is there some advice in how to do this exploratory thing in a good way? Like how to drive and navigate through the exploratory space, not to like burn too much finances, but also like to stay on target? Like what would be your heuristic or like?
Yeah, that's a good question. Start small, obviously. I like literally maybe one person. You can explore within your own time, on your own means, and get to the point where you've got something that's a solid idea that you could then expand into a smaller team, for example. But even then, you're going to want people that come onto your team to have room to explore their part of the equation. I think it's important being a team, and this was the mentality I always tried to have at the early days of Media Molecule, is it's not, okay, I'm the creative director or I'm the lead designer, but that doesn't mean I'm designing the whole game or coming up with all the ideas. I'm just a sort of facilitator, really. It's important to get other people, you want people to be invested and care about what they're doing, so they've got to better put their ideas into the game as well, and in that sense, being a creative director is much more about how do we make all these different ideas actually work together into something that's coherent. I always used to sort of visualise it as being in a room and everyone's got clay that they can throw at this table and you're just there in the middle trying to help it mould it into something, So that's really important, letting other people get their ideas across. But in terms of actually exploring in that way, I think, if you were like literally going from nothing to starting something, the important thing is to do something, not sit there with like, I've got writer's block, I don't know what to do. Just do something, even if it's just like, oh, fuck it, I've got no idea, so I'm just going to remake Space Invaders or something. I'm just going to start typing and start doing stuff, because that's when the ideas will come with that mentality, It's literally, oh, yeah, I'm making Space Invaders. Oh, I've made a bug. The characters go way off to the left and actually they're appearing from the bottom. Oh, that's quite cool, mate. I'll just go with that and make that. And before you know it, you've got something completely original or something that's rubbish, I don't know, but you've explored. So you've got to be doing stuff for stuff to be able to happen, I suppose, is the point. And, you can give yourself time limits. You go, right, I'm going to jam on this one particular little idea for a month or a week or something and see what happens. In fact, game jams are a really good, within a larger team, I would argue that's quite a good method for doing that sort of mentality in a bit more of a controlled, budgety type of way. It's like, right, okay, we know that in our game, we quite like the idea of there being this type of character that lives in this sort of world. And that's it. Let people go off and just game jam for a week or something and do crazy little things, and that can throw up some cool ideas, and they can be like, right, okay, cool, we're going to take that, and now we're going forward with that. And so you can sort of, if you wanted to turn it into a process, I suppose that would be one way of doing it. But at its core, it is just doing tight, making and playing, and you get like a loop that goes on, and responding to the thing that you're making, and having an open ear to it. Try not to be too set in your mind of what this final thing is that you're going to make. You've got to allow yourself to. I feel like you get to a certain stage with a project, and the main influence, if it's something original, the main influence on it becomes its own, is itself. It starts to speak to you, and it starts to. It's more like you're discovering what this thing is rather than making what this thing is, if that makes sense. So sort of being attuned to that and open to that is the key thing, I think.
Okay, nice, perfect.
I don't know if that's a good way of describing it, but it's I'll tell you what I can do is recommend a very good book, actually, which I didn't think would exist, but there's a what's it called? I've got it over there. So Rick Rubin's is like a music producer type guy. He's worked with loads of bands, Chili Peppers or people like that, and he released this book. I think it's just called The Creative Process or something like that. Over there. I think I lent it to somebody. But anyway, Rick Rubin's The Creative Process, something like that. And it's just a fantastic book that really actually captures what I've feebly been trying to describe in terms of like the creative process. And I remember reading this book and I'm like, I'm not mad. This is all the stuff that totally hits the spot with me, and you can almost use it like an oracle. You don't have to read it from start to finish. You can just open up and read a little chapter, and it will have some really nicely worded kind of descriptions of the creative process and things. It's really cool. So
okay,
good book.
Rick Rubin, The Creative Process, or something like that.
Something like that. Yeah.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you for joining me. Thank you for this discussion. Where is there like you have social media where people can follow your work and you?
I have a Twitter account, whatever you call it. Can't remember what I'm called. Marcos Healey, I think. Twitter. Which is mostly me posting work in progress on my Commodore 64 project. Actually, we didn't talk about that, but I started off as a Commodore 64 programmer, and I kind of went back to doing a little bit just as a nostalgia, self-indulgent kind of thing. So I said, I'm going to have a go at making a LittleBigPlanet type game on the Commodore 64. Why not? So if you go to my Twitter account, you'll see some work in progress of that, for example, plus some random things. And that's about it. I mean, I've got a YouTube channel, but that's just mostly stupid family videos and stuff like that. I'm not a YouTuber in any sense of the word. But I suppose Twitter would be my main social account thing.
Perfect. Yeah. Perfect. Mark, thank you so much.
Cool. Okay, well, thank you. Nice to speak to you, dude.